In the ventricles?
They're located in the ventricles. When on the EKG, where on the EKG do we see the bundle branches? See, I put in quotes. See. Where do we see them fire?
In the RS?
Like what lead
delay.
we see him
No.
No, you.
My question is,
You
where
don't.
do we see, and I put see in quotes on purpose, where do we see the bundle branches depolarize on the EKG?
You don't?
You don't.
I put C in quotes.
Okay.
Oh,
So maybe you guys don't understand the
between
quote, the quote things.
P-
I know you're not gonna see it.
PR interval.
Where does it happen on the EKG?
PR interval.
During the PR interval. Do y'all understand that? Do y'all remember that?
Yeah.
No, I don't get it. Sorry. Go back.
What does the P wave represent?
The atrial depolarization.
Be more specific.
The
And
atrial contraction.
Thank you. So the P wave equals atrial contractile cell depolarization. Yes?
Yes.
What does the QRS represent?
Ventricle contractile depolarization.
Ventricular contractile cell depolarization. Yes?
Yes.
And the T wave is what?
Repolarization of the
Ventricular repolarization.
ventricles.
Be more specific.
Ventricle contractile cell repolarization.
Ventricular contractile cell repolarization. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. What causes ventricular contractile cell depolarization?
All at once would be the signal going through the right and left bundle branches.
What is the thing that leads to ventricular contractile cell depolarization? The thing that, where the very next thing is ventricular contractile cell depolarization.
Moving of ions.
The signal going through the AV node and the Purkinje fire and the branches down to the Purkinje fire.
Are
Okay.
you talking about ions?
Ventricular contractile cell depolarization is caused by this one thing, which might be caused by something, which might be caused by something. What's that?
Calcium?
I have channels
My
reaching
question is
essential.
not coming through.
No.
It's me, it's not you. I'll change my question.
That's a first.
It all depends like when you're asking it.
I know. I'm not asking about ions.
Okay.
I'm asking about conduction right now. So stay with me with conduction. So I'm talking about which cells are leading to which cells, which are leading to which cells, and what I'm asking right now is what's going to lead to ventricular contractile cell depolarization.
Purkinje fibers?
Thank you. The Purkinje fibers.
Okay.
The Purkinje fibers lead to that, right? What leads to Purkinje fiber depolarization?
Bundle branches.
Bundle branches. And backwards,
Bundle of his.
bundle of his, and backwards,
AV node.
AV, and backwards,
Atrial.
atrial pathways, and backwards,
SA node.
SA node eventually, yes? Okay?
Yes.
And now we're going this direction. What does the QRS represent?
Ventricular contraction.
Ventricular contractile cell depolarization.
Yes.
Where does the QRS start on our EKG?
At the end of the Purkinje fiber.
At the ventricular
On the
contraction.
EKG.
When the Purkinje fiber delivers it to the
On the
contractile.
EKG means you have to give me EKG
At the
names.
Q.
Oh,
At the
Q.
beginning of the Q.
At the beginning of the Q.
At the first deviation from the baseline after the P.
Yeah.
Nailed
Which would be the
it.
Q.
Maybe.
Which would be
It's
the Q.
definition of Q.
But at the beginning of the Q,
Yeah.
which is at the end of what?
PRI.
At the end of the PR interval. So this right here starts the QRS, which means all of this has to be done by the end of the PR interval. That make sense?
Yes.
In the perfect world.
And it's the AV that delays it. That gives it some space for their PR interval.
Well, if it delays
Some of
would
it,
be done.
but yes.
So everything from the
Even more done.
past the SA node to the Purkinje fibers is all in the PRI.
So my question to you originally was, where do we see the bundle branches fire?
In the PR interval.
In the PR interval. That's where we see the bundle branches fire. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, what we're going to talk about now is what happens when those bundle branches have some problem with them, right? So when we talk about the bundle branches, and we talk about a block being in the bundle branches, that they don't block the same. The left and right don't block quite the same way. So that's just something that we have to keep in mind. They don't block the same way, but when they do block, and we can no longer send the signal through or past a certain part within the bundle branch, does that mean that the ventricular contractile cells will not receive the signal to fire? So explain it. We have somebody who wants to. Looking for me?
So does that mean that it's gonna go cell to cell? If
Yeah.
the right side's blocked, it's gonna go through the left, hit the
Fast.
Purkinje, hit the contractile, and then slow out through cell to cell
From
into the right?
Or left.
Or
To the right
it'll
side.
take the right will start at the top,
Nope.
because that's where the block is,
Okay, so
the cell to cell, or wherever the block
That
is,
was my
at the
question
point of
too.
the block.
It was what it's gonna look like if we have a block.
so my question is, if there's a block in the bundle branches, does that mean that the ventricular contractile cells will not receive their signal?
No,
No.
it does not.
How do they receive their signal?
Well, they'll receive it from the side that is not blocked
In what
in
way?
the normal fashion,
Okay.
in a not abnormal fashion.
Great.
And then it's gonna continue passing that cell to cell to cell to the side that's blocked.
Good. So we will still have ventricular polarization on the side that has the blockage within those arrhythmic cells, but instead of it going through that Purkinje system, it'll end up going cell to cell. Does that make sense?
Yes.
There's also all kinds of combinations of that. For example, we might have a block in a bundle branch someplace, and it starts going cell to cell, but at some point in time gets back into the algorithmic cells from the back end that then deliver that signal to a different part of the ventricles in a faster manner. So you might have a slow start to something, but a fast finish. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's also a possibility. In doing this, it leads to a situation where we might see, or it might seem like we have multiple QRS complexes. Because if the signal is going through, let's say that the signal is going through the left side correctly, and there's a block on the right side, right? That means from the EKG standpoint, this is, remember that, what's the x-axis of the EKG?
Time.
Time. So this might get the signal very, very quickly, which gives us the start of what seems to be a normal QRS complex, right? And so we see the spike because it went through the Purkinje fibers, it fired like it was supposed to, so we see the start of a normal QRS complex, right? But this was still depolarizing slower. And because this is depolarizing slower, that happened, we saw a QRS complex start, but then this starts to go and gives us a second QRS complex. Does that make sense? All tucked into the same QRS complex, but it seems like we have different QRS complexes. It could be a situation where, let's say the right side is working normally, and it starts a QRS complex because it happened fast like it was supposed to, but the left side was blocked, so we didn't see a QRS mix in the mix at that point in time, but it starts to come later. But then after it starts to come later, that signal that was going cell to cell, so we had a QRS for the right side, we started to see another QRS for the left side, but then in the process of it going cell to cell, it gets back into the autorhythmic cells, fires again, and gives us a third QRS complex. All tucked into the same QRS complex. Does that make sense what I just said?
Yes.
You might see many different, I'm going to give you lots of examples today, but you might see several different examples of how a QRS complex might look like it's got several QRS complexes superimposed on top of it.
How come you can't tell a fast single contraction versus that other section of the contraction that's going off the contractile cell's intrinsic rates versus getting an electrical signal. You know what I mean?
I'm not sure I do know what you mean, because I think you can tell that. So maybe I'm not understanding your question.
Well, how do you tell?
So maybe I'm not understanding your question. So ask your question a different way, or
so
again.
like, if you're looking and you have R and then you have R prime,
Yes,
and one of those is it going off in the normal fashion, and then the second one is delayed, and so it's been delayed long enough where
Yeah.
it's the contractile cell going.
yes.
Why is that R prime not significantly different than R?
Why is it not significantly different than R?
Because they just look like two little things stacked on top of each other, right?
Yeah.
And then you just lose.
Not always. Yes and no. Sometimes your R and R prime don't look like two QRS complexes that look normal. Sometimes one of the R's, the R or the R prime, looks funky and weird. It doesn't always look exactly like two QRS complexes. That completely depends on how cell to cell one side is versus the other.
Okay. Is that important information to know?
It'll become important information for you to know while you're determining where the block actually is. But whether or not the QRS complex looks one way or the other in and of itself doesn't matter, other than being able to tell where it's at.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good. Which you will be able to tell very easily where these are at,
Based on, okay.
based on what you see in particular leads. You need to look in particular leads on this.
Got
Right, so in order to, you don't need a 12 lead to determine that a bundle branch block is likely occurring, okay? But you do need a 12 lead to determine where that bundle branch block is. Does that make sense? In addition to that, there are some leads that when you see the bundle branch block, you can tell it's a bundle branch block, but it looks normal enough in that particular lead that you can't quite tell what side it's at. And side becomes important in a couple of different things. One is that if you have a right bundle branch block, but a left-sided myocardial infarction, you can still enter them into a STEMI system. But if you have a left bundle branch block with a left-sided MI, you cannot. Because you can't tell if they're having a left-sided MI if they have a concurrent left-sided bundle branch block at the same time. It won't show up on the EKG properly. So you'll have to use blood tests and this kind of thing. So knowing which side it is becomes important on things like whether or not you can enter them into the STEMI program, change the pathway at the hospital, some of these other things. Okay, we good so far? Okay, so in terms of our concept map of bundle branches, you already understand this, right? Except I'm going to take it one step further and say we've got the left and right bundle branches, the right and left. We've got the right and left bundle branches. The left bundle branch and the right bundle branch are not the same. The right bundle branch sends the signal all the way through the right bundle branch and meets and is joined by the Purkinje fibers. So the Purkinje fibers get the signal to fire directly from the right bundle branch block, or directly from the right bundle branch. On the left side, that's not the case. The left side, the thick bundle branch only goes so far and then it splits again. And it's going to split into what we call fascicles. We've got an anterior fascicle and a posterior fascicle. The left anterior and left posterior fascicle. And in about 85% of people, we actually have a septal fascicle also on the left side. So it's going to branch and split as we go. And the Purkinje fibers will actually get their signal directly from the fascicles. And the only reason why that becomes important is because left bundle branches are they're bigger. You often have what we call hemiblocks, because you don't often get the left bundle branch to block completely. It gets to the left bundle branch, and then our blocks happen in either the anterior or posterior fascicle. Then there's not the two fascicles are also not equal. For example, we will almost always, when we have a hemiblock, have a left anterior fascicle hemiblock, not a posterior fascicle hemiblock. And that's because the left anterior fascicle anatomically is sporadic. It comes into a fascicle and then sporadically hits the Purkinje fibers as it goes. And so when you block the left fascicle, it usually takes out everything after that with the Purkinje system. But the posterior fascicle looks like a fan. So if you block it at any point in time and things start going cell to cell, that cell-to-cell transmission pops right back into the Purkinje fibers really fast. And so it's really difficult to block that posterior fascicle. You'd have to have a good portion of it completely dead before you block that posterior fascicle. So we start to see different things of importance, right? If you have a posterior hemiblock, it is typically a larger, more serious blood flow problem than if you have a left anterior hemiblock. Because what it takes to block that posterior fascicle is a lot of cellular death or cellular disruption. Whereas it doesn't take much on the anterior fascicle. Does that make sense? So even things like that can give you a clue as to how serious this problem actually is in this patient right now. Good? And then of course if it's a full left bundle branch block, meaning it took out all of the fascicles on top of that, it's even that much larger in terms of an event that's occurring for that patient. Good?
And we're gonna go over determining,
Where it's at, yes.
Or an event that has occurred.
Or an event that has occurred. Yeah,
So
we
it's
can't tell if
dead
it's,
septic tissue.
yeah, we can't tell if it's current or not,
It's not a new.
right? Which you'll take with your history, that you'll write down in your really well-written narratives.
Amen.
Good? Okay. All right, so we are looking here and here. All of the drawings that you see are gonna be frustrating, that you see, right? In fact, he's already sick of me. So for example, this picture that I'm showing you right here, I need you to take a moment to kind of think three-dimensional for just a minute. Because I've already shown you two pictures that are in conflict with each other, even if you haven't been able to tell that. I'll show them again. So this is showing the left posterior fascicle here, and the left anterior fascicle here. That very first picture that I showed you right here showed you the posterior fascicle here and the anterior fascicle here, right? It looks like they're in the opposite place. Please don't be confused by that. What does anterior and posterior mean? Front to back, not superior and inferior. Does that make sense? So this is actually wrapping behind the heart, and this is wrapping up in front of the heart. And so when illustrators illustrate it, whether or not they put one on top of the other is just because you can't draw three-dimensional on a two-dimensional medium. Does that make sense? So the posterior fascicle is going behind the heart. The anterior fascicle is coming in front of the heart. And whether or not the author puts it above or below is just because that's the way they interpret the orientation of the heart when they're drawing. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So look at the actual construction of it. And the posterior fascicle is much more fan-like. So these would all be the Purkinje fibers that you see right here coming off of the actual fascicle. And that fan is what's really difficult to block. If you have a block, say right here, it doesn't take much for the signal that went through here to go cell to cell and get right back into a Purkinje system and continue right on down the line. So you have to wipe out not just this part, but you have to wipe out the entire fascicle from there on to block that posterior fascicle. Versus on the anterior fascicle, it doesn't take much.
so the Purkinje fibers on that drawing, and I don't know, it looks like there's 20. Are there like thousands of them?
Yes, hundreds of thousands. Yeah.
Is the right one anterior, posterior?
So not really, because the right doesn't quite have a anterior
Start.
posterior. It has a, it's all right on one side, right, that lateral side. It doesn't wrap all the way around like the left ventricle does. So just remember your anatomy of the right ventricle compared to the left. Yes, ma'am?
So when you refer to a hemiblock, it's inherently the left side then?
Only, because the left side is the only side that has a fascicle,
Got it.
right? And hemiblock means half block or something. It's specifically meaning that a fascicle is blocked. So you can't have a right hemi block because the right side doesn't split into any additional fascicles. It's either it or not it, compared to the left side.
Hey, are those, the way that they wrap around anterior posterior, is that, mirroring the coronary arteries too? Like, can you kind of link those and you're not,
No.
don't do that? Okay.
No, don't do that. They permeate the cellular tissue much more than the arteries do. You can kind of think of it in like how capillaries are, but there's many more capillaries even than what we have with these. But you can't mirror it along the side. But you can take blood flow with the heart and know what part of the bundle branch is going to be affected. Right?
Okay.
But they are separate and they don't track together in that same sense.
So when you're talking about, block specifically, bundle branch block, you are not talking about ischemia.
No. I am not talking about a blood, when I say that it's blocked, I mean that there are cells that are no longer able to transmit their ions through gap junctions to the next cell.
Okay.
Why they can't do that absolutely could be because they were ischemic.
ATP issue.
Yes,
Got it.
that's correct. So they do track together in that sense, because a blood flow problem would lead to an ischemic problem of the cells, which would lead to the inability of that cell to transmit its ions to the next cell, and that's the block.
Got it.
Okay? We good on that? Everybody? This is stuff you already know in terms of how it goes. And where our question right now is on these bundle branches, as it's traveling down the bundle branches, what's going to happen, or what are the possibilities of things that are going to occur at the part of the bundle branch. So, if there's a block somewhere in that bundle branch, and you guys already talked about this, it means that because it can't go through the Purkinje system anymore, it has to start going cell to cell on the side that it's blocked. That's a backup system that the heart has, and you're really happy about that, right?
Yeah.
Because if we do have a problem with those autorhythmic cells, it's great that the heart can still fire and still send blood flow, which we want to have. But it's much slower and much less efficient. It's much harder to generate the necessary contractile forces to overcome the pressure within the aorta, but it still can. And that's what's really important. But it does become slow, and depending on where it is, it'll become more or less chaotic. So what do you think is going to be which QRS complex would be a more chaotic QRS complex? A QRS complex that's coming from a person that has a right bundle branch block, or a person that has a left bundle branch block?
Left,
And why?
larger.
There's more
Because there's-
pathways, and there's more ways to kind of like short circuit it and get around when there's blockages and restart it.
Okay. Others?
Would it be
Why would
off-
the left side look more chaotic and weird?
Because it takes up more electrical activity than the right.
Yeah, because there's more electricity happening on the left side to begin with. So if it's disrupted, it has a lot more chance of looking weird. If the left side is not disrupted and the right side is disrupted, then the majority of our electrical activity is still not disrupted. And so things look more normal when a left side is working properly and the right side isn't. Okay. So then, let's talk about this right side. So the question here is, somewhere in this right bundle branch, before it gets to the Purkinje fibers, there is some sort of a blockage. Make sense? What are things that we're going to see on the EKG, do you think? What's the first thing that you would have to notice on the EKG?
Slurred QRS or a
Wide.
A wider QRS. Absolutely. You have to have a wide QRS to begin with, right? Because that's what tells you that everything is going cell to cell, right? The measurements that you have for your QRS are the max measurements that it can go and still be making it through the autorhythmic cells, right? So our QRS complex is supposed to be what in terms of its size?
less than
Less than 0.12. Point, 10 or greater. Does that make sense? I'm saying, or less than. It's going to be equal to or less than 0.10.
That was 0.11.
0.11, if we want to argue 0.11.
I'm just going by what you,
That's perfectly
what you
fine.
put in my brain.
But less than 0.12.
Okay.
So therefore, if we have a QRS complex that is 0.12 or wider, then what we have to be saying to ourselves is that something's not right about the autorhythmic cells. It's not, somewhere in there, there's cell-to-cell transmission happening. Does that make sense? So in order to have a bundle branch block, by definition, if you have a bundle branch block, things have to be going cell to cell, right? Because if things were not going cell to cell, then that means everything made it through the autorhythmic cells all the way to the Purkinje fibers, so that the Purkinje fibers could fire everything at once. Does that make sense? So you have to, first criteria of a bundle branch block, you have to have a wide QRS complex. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And that's actually really our second main criteria. Because we have to have a certain type of rhythm before we can have that wide QRS complex. And what's that?
Sinus or atrial.
Sinus
Yeah, that
or
would be
atrial,
Yeah, yeah, that.
or,
A narrow QRS.
but we're not going to have a narrow QRS.
Or,
You said wide.
yeah.
Sinus or atrial, or, which means you have to have what kind of a rhythm? You have to have a supraventricular rhythm to begin with. You have to have a supraventricular rhythm, because if you have a ventricular rhythm, what do we already know?
You have a wide QRS.
You have a wide QRS already, if you have a ventricular rhythm, right? Things are already going cell to cell in the QRS, because everything's gone to hell in the autorhythmic cells before that, right? So you have to have a supraventricular rhythm to begin with. If you have a supraventricular rhythm that has a wide QRS, then it means the supraventricular rhythm, everything was working down through the AV node, and then something got messed up after the junction, which is in the bundle branches. Does that make sense? So we have a supraventricular rhythm with a wide QRS. A supraventricular rhythm with a wide QRS tells us that we have a bundle branch block someplace. Good? Okay, so then we're going to look on the right side, right? Everything is going down the left side normally. It's the right side that is causing the problem, okay? For whatever reason. The right side is now going cell to cell. The QRS complex is going to be 0.12 or greater, and it can start to give us additional QRS complex waves. Because now we have the left side firing like it's supposed to, and the right side firing later, because it takes longer to get to those cells. Does that make sense? Heads up and down or side to side. Something that lets me know I need to say more or say less. Fantastic. So, it'll take the waves we currently have, it'll change them, it'll make them look different, and it can make it so it looks like we have additional waves. But we have a supraventricular rhythm with a wide QRS. Good? That might give us a couple of different things. It might give us an RSR pattern, and I'm going to talk about things to look at first, and I'm going to talk about things that paramedics like to talk about, but that I want you to think better than that. It might give us an RSR type pattern, because we might start to see multiple QRS complexes, all right? We see those multiple QRS complexes most commonly in the right-sided electrodes. In the right-sided electrodes.
Would it typically be in the septal leads?
Yeah, so that's why we see them.
That's
right
what I was, is that normal for most bundle branch blocks? You'll see it most prominent, like the RSR.
We're just, not most,
Sorry,
we're talking right,
right, okay.
okay? And the reason for that is because all the other leads, for the most part, are looking on the left side, right? When you see, for example, lead 1, or V5, or V6, any of these leads over here, the right stuff is all hidden because the left stuff is what's most prominent in those leads, okay? So those left-sided leads have a hard time seeing accurately what's happening on the right side over here. So it's blunted. The stuff that's happening on the right side gets blunted a little bit. It gets a little bit more mixed in to the tail end of the left-sided QRS complex. Does that make sense? In addition to that, the right stuff, the right-sided electricity is traveling in what direction compared to our left, or mainly our left leads? Away from, which means it's already going to be a negative view. Does that make sense? So it's going to be mixed in to the dropping, to the downslope of our left-sided QRS complex, which hides it even more, right? But when we're looking at V1, V1 is staring at the right side, right? It's staring at the right side. The right side didn't fire when it normally does for V1. The left side fired early. It didn't fire early, it fired on time, and the right side was being delayed a little bit, right? So we see a QRS complex from the left side in V1, but once that's done, very, very clearly, we see that right-sided QRS next. It's not hidden by the left-sided stuff because V1 is not behind the left ventricle, it's right on top of the right ventricle. So it sees the right-sided QRS very easily. Does that make sense? So we look at V1, sometimes V2, because V2 looks very closely to what V1 is looking at, but V1 is our big one. We look at V1, and we'll often see clear double QRS patterns. A left-sided QRS and a right-sided QRS. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Questions on that? We good? Okay, so let's talk about the criteria that we'll have. And we're going to show it. I'll show it. So the very first thing we have, is what kind of a rhythm?
Why?
Okay, we start with a supraventricular rhythm. We have a supraventricular rhythm that has a wide QRS. We have to start there. If we don't have a wide QRS, we do not have a bundle branch block. If we see multiple QRS peaks in a rhythm that is not a wide QRS, can it be a bundle branch block?
No.
No. Because what do you have to have a bundle branch block? You have to have a wide QRS, because that's the only way that we can say it's going cell to cell. Otherwise, it would be going through the algorithmic, still going through the algorithmic
What
stuff.
would that be then, though? If you had
We'll come back to that later. But the point is, you have to have a wide QRS first. Okay? All right. We have a wide QRS complex. The very first place that we'll look, if we have a wide QRS complex and we're trying to determine left or right, is we're going to look in leads 1 and V6. I haven't talked about those leads yet. But we're going to look in leads 1 and V6. Leads 1 and V6 look where?
Lateral,
Where laterally?
Left lateral.
left lateral.
Left lateral at what degree, basically? At 0 degrees, right? What will the right side, when the right side fires, what kind of a wave will the right side make in leads 1 and V6? A negative wave. Does that make sense?
Moving
So
away.
leads 1 and V6 are over here. Where's the muscle mass on the right side? Do you understand? Anatomically, where is the muscle mass for the right ventricle?
On the opposite side of the arm.
Yeah, clear over on the opposite side. And how do the ventricles depolarize? How do the ventricles depolarize? Use
Inside.
medical terminology.
All at the same time.
Well, they depolarize
Into out,
superior.
Say it.
into out, or,
Out to in.
You said it, but use medical terminology now.
oh god.
And include the heart muscle medical terminology with it as well. Say that again.
Endocardium, epicardium.
There you go. That's what Mons is trying to say. Endocardium to epicardium. Does that make sense? From the inside of the heart to the outside of the heart. So from the right side, if it's going from the inside of the heart to the outside of the heart, and all of the muscle mass for the right ventricle is on the outside of the heart, on the right border of the heart, then from a lead 1 standpoint, what direction is the electrical activity traveling?
Away from it.
Away. Fantastic. Now, the right side is now depolarizing when compared to the left side? After, later. So we see a good R wave in leads 1 and V6, and after we see a decent R wave, we see what?
Negative.
We see a negative wave. What kind of wave is it?
S.
We see an S wave. Does that make sense? And where in the QRS complex is the timing going wrong?
On the right,
Yeah, in the right
Wide-
side,
wide
so
S
therefore
wave.
in the S wave. So what will happen to the S wave?
That'd be wider.
Does that make sense? So within the QRS complex, we can actually go a step further. The R part of the QRS complex will seem absolutely normal and narrow, and the S part of the complex will seem wide in leads 1 and V6. Does that make sense? We say that the S wave is slurred. We say we have a slurred S wave. It does create a little bit of a problem in that sometimes it makes it hard to tell, wow, do we have a slurred S wave or do we have ST depression that's being weird? And so I'll tell you up front, it can be difficult to kind of tell in leads 1 and V6 if that slurred S wave is a slurred S wave or if it has ST depression built into it, right? But that's why we have a 12 lead, because you can just go to a different lead to find out the width of the QRS complex, and then go back to leads 1 and V6 to determine how wide that QRS complex is in that lead. Does that make sense? Using additional tools to help you out. But it might take some investigation. But you want to look in leads 1 and V6 first, and you should see a slurred S wave in leads 1 and V6. After you look at that, then you'll go back to V1 and V2, but specifically V1, and see if you can see R prime waves. You should have an RSR pattern or a QS or a QR pattern, which I'm going to discuss in just a minute, where the R prime is the largest. The R prime is either positive, where the Q wave was negative, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or you have an RSR pattern where the R prime is the larger of the two. And that should make sense to you because why? Why would the R prime be larger
More
in V1?
more electrical activity.
Give me more information.
that's when the majority of the muscles fire.
Because that's when the majority of the muscle for what?
For the left ventricle.
From the right ventricle, what it's looking at.
Yeah, where does V1 look?
V1 looks at V1 looks at the right side.
V1 looks at the right side. So the left side, even though the left side has more muscle mass, V1 doesn't see a lot of it, right? Because V1 is looking at the right side. Because V1 is right here.
V1 looks from the center of the heart.
V1 is looking right at the septum, and it's looking right at that right side. Right? Remember that? You guys remember anatomically?
Big heart.
How is this heart situated in my chest? How? Okay, and how else?
Rotated to the left.
Like this. So therefore, the right muscle mass is actually more anterior in my chest cavity. So when I set my lead, V1, on my septum, it's actually looking directly at the right muscle mass. Does that make sense?
V1 is
Anatomically.
looking right at the septum. I thought your heart was shifted a little bit more to the left, so that V1
Great.
is on the right side.
It is on the right side. That is correct. V1 is on my right, but V1 is right there.
Yeah,
My heart is, here's my septum, and it's turned like that.
I thought your heart was sitting right here.
My heart is sitting right there,
Okay,
and V1 is right here,
okay, great.
looking at the right side.
So can you tell me, talk about the R prime, explain again which one's stronger, taller? What did you say?
The R prime
Yes.
will be the largest of the two, because it's right here. And the left side, 2V1, will either be negative, because the electricity is traveling away, or biphasic, because it's traveling this direction, right? So the R wave in V1, when it's present, is small, right?
Our prime will be the first.
But our prime is the second thing that's happening, which is that right-sided after the bundle branch block. So it becomes very large. It's sitting right there at the V1. It's looking right at V1.
So it'll be small.
Small, big. Yeah, and I'll give you several examples of what that might look like. Okay? I have a supraventricular rhythm. My QS complex is wide. I'm looking in lead 2 because I'm just watching dynamically as it goes by. I just put the leads on my patient. I notice that I've got a supraventricular, I've got a sinus rhythm on the monitor, but I look at my QS and I go, it's wide. Oh, okay, I've got a bundle branch somehow. I throw them on a 12 lead, my 12 lead prints off, and I notice slurred S waves in leads 1 and V6. I then look at V1, and I see a double peaked V1. That tells me it's a right-sided bundle branch block. Does that make sense?
What will the difference between V1 and V2 be?
What would be the difference between, and there may not be any difference. V2, so they're both right here. So V2 looks, they're both right here. V2 looks at some of the right side, but a lot more of the left side also. So sometimes, depending on the anatomy of that person, V2 might not show you anything that V1's looking at, or it might show you a lot of what V1's looking at, or any combination in between.
Okay.
So oftentimes what I see in V1, I see in V2 as well. So I look at those two leads for concurrence, just to see that I'm
I see
looking
it more in V1 than
but also,
V2.
but V1 is
just
really what I'm looking at.
more confirms, right?
Yeah, I could go a step further on this one as well. Where else could I look in here? I could go a step further and I could say slurred S waves in leads 1 and V6 are what we're looking at, but what other lead could we also look in and probably see a slurred S wave as well?
V5.
V5. Yeah, because V5 looks at very similar to what V6 is. But it's off just a little bit, V5 is, so sometimes it doesn't show that. So the key leads are leads 1, V6, and V1, and V5 and V2 might come into play as well.
I'm sorry.
Does that make sense? Okay, so because the right side is depolarizing later, because there's a block in the bundle branch block, in that right bundle branch. So because it's depolarizing later, right? Because it's depolarizing later, we end up with a different R wave that shows up in V1 specifically and sometimes V2, right? Also because it's depolarizing later, leads 1 and V6 and sometimes a little bit of V5 shows a clear S wave. And that S wave is wider, okay? So those are the key areas that we're looking at. Those are the key areas that we're looking at. Look at it here. So notice the colors here. We're just looking at the ventricles. So the heart has depolarized. The very first thing to depolarize is the septum, almost always, the first part of the septum. And that comes from the septal fascicle of the left bundle branch. Okay? The septal fascicle of the left bundle branch sends the septum off first. Incidentally, the most common place that you see physiologic Q waves is in lead 1, right over here. And that's because this fires first and it's going in one direction to lead 1.
Away from.
Yeah, so that's why we see Q waves in lead 1 that are non-pathologic. The rest of the ventricles are going to fire normally. So the rest of the ventricles will fire absolutely normally on the left side. It fires first and it fires normally. Great. After that, then the rest of the right ventricle takes forever as it's going cell to cell. Does that make sense? So all of the width, all of the widening of the QRS happens in the second part of it, not in the first part of it. When I'm looking at V1, which is right here, when I'm looking at V1, it sees this stuff happen first, and then right after that, then it sees the big massive stuff that's coming right at it. And that's why we see much larger second R wave. Are we clear? In 1V6, which is hanging out over here, we see a solid R wave like we're supposed to from the left ventricle, and then we start to see the right ventricle firing away from it, so we see a big S wave, and that's where the QRS widens, is in that S category for the leads 1 and V6. So slurred S waves in V1 and lead 1 and V6, and a double depolarization in V1.
Why wouldn't the R wave be negative for, in V1, if it's,
This one?
yeah, if it's depolarizing endocardium to epicardium away from the camera, why wouldn't it be negative?
That's a really good question.